Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our webinar. We are going to get started. Today, we're here to talk about unpacking PPP forgiveness. I'm going to ask that you please post all your questions in the Q&A only. There are a lot of people here, and this will make it for the moderators. Please be rest assured that a recording of this webinar and slides will be posted shortly after we're finished on our community site at realtime.inc.com. And later in this day, we will also be emailing a copy to all participants in the webinar. So you will be getting copies of this. You do not have to take notes. A little bit about myself. I am the founder and CEO of MultiFunding. I'm an Inc. columnist writing on business lending issues. I'm regularly featured in the press on small business and business lending issues. I've advised prior administrations as well as the Federal Reserve and Treasury Department on business credit markets. I have a book out called The Growth Dilemma that you can find on Amazon. And from my entrepreneur organization friends out there, I'm a proud EO board member of EO Philadelphia. You're not here to learn about me, you're here to learn about PPP forgiveness. My lawyers just asked me to make a few disclaimers. We are in an unprecedented time in history, and the information available to us is changing rapidly. Please refer to our most current presentation for education. The information it provided is based upon our best judgment about what we know at this time. However, key questions remain about how to implement the PPP forgiveness. MultiFunding LLC does not accept any liability as it relates to the timeliness or content of the information we are sharing today or may share in the future, and we are under no legal duty to update any such information or recommendations. And we encourage you to check in with your attorneys, CPAs, and financial advisors for additional insights. Before we talk about the PPP forgiveness, some context is very important. First of all, there's still time. The earliest forgiveness application will be accepted 56 days after you received your PPP or it was dispersed. So it will be at least a few weeks before anyone is submitting their PPP forgiveness application. On Friday night, the SBA and Treasury Department released an 11-page forgiveness application. While that's a great start, there are still a lot of questions. Just an hour or two ago, President Trump was suggesting a whole bunch of rule changes. So as information progresses, and we expect it will, we will provide updated ominars as necessary when the information changes. But today we want to describe what we know. It is important for everyone to remember the intent of the PPP. It was to provide every business owner or entrepreneur who wanted to participate with 2 months of forgivable payroll expense, assuming that you keep your people employed during the required time. And as a little bit of bonus, it allowed you to provide you with forgivable rent, utilities, and interest during the time, assuming these expenses do not exceed 25% of your total forgiveness. Remember, this is the Paycheck Protection Program, not the Entrepreneur Protection Program. It's designed primarily to save paychecks. So a framework that is important to consider. When you applied, you should have gotten 10 weeks of your eligible payroll amount. Your application had nothing to do with rent, utilities, or anything like that. It purely had to do with 10 weeks of your payroll. And you are eligible for 8 weeks of forgiveness. If you do not deviate from your payroll at all, you have 2 weeks of extra surplus or 20% to apply to rent, utilities, and interest on your building. Looking at it through some numbers. If you are approved for a $100,000 PPP covering 10 weeks of allowable payroll expense, and if you spent $80,000 on 8 weeks of payroll during the allowable 8-week period, you now have up to $20,000 left to spend on rent, utilities, or interest during the 8-week time. If you spent $15,000 on these categories, you will have a small balance due on your loan. If you spent more than $20,000 in these categories, you will have the $20,000 and your entire PPP forgiven. Let me give you some examples. Let's say that you take that $100,000 PPP and the amount you spent during the 8 weeks was $80,000, and the amount you spent on the rent, utilities, and interest was $15,000. You can ask and should have no issue receiving $95,000 worth of forgiveness, and you will have a small loan balance of $5,000. As another example, in the same company, if you spent the $80,000, but you spent $20,000 in rent, utilities, and interest, your total forgiveness ask is $100,000, and you will have a loan balance of $0. Remember what you agreed to when you took the loan. Irrespective of whether the money is forgiven, you only agreed to use the money for eligible payroll costs, rent, interest on your mortgage or utilities. You didn't agree to use it for anything else. And it is imperative that you keep methodical records of your expenses in these categories. Forgiveness and context. If you have made no changes to your payroll, you will get 2 months of payroll expenses forgiven, plus whatever is left for rent, utilities, and or interest if the amount does not exceed 25% of your total ask. But if you did not bring everybody back, or you reduced pay plus pay by more than 25%, the process is going to get a lot more complicated for you. What are the allowable payroll costs for forgiveness? You are allowed for compensation to employees in the form of salary, wages, commissions, or other similar compensation. Cash tips or the equivalent, based on your records or good faith estimates, are allowed. Payment for vacation, parental, family, medical, sick leave are allowed. You can allow for separation or dismissal, payment for the provision of employee benefits consisting of group healthcare coverage, including insurance premiums and retirement. Eligible is payment of state and local taxes assessed on compensation of employees. If you are an independent contractor or sole proprietor, wages, commissions, income, or net earnings from self-employment or similar compensation are eligible. What is not included? Any compensation of an employee whose principal place of residence is not the United States. The compensation of an individual employee in excess of an annual salary of $100,000, prorated as necessary. Federal employment taxes imposed or withheld between February 15th, 2020 and June 30th, 2020, including the employees and employer's share of FICA and Railroad Retirement Act taxes and income taxes required to be withheld from employees, and qualified sick and family leave wages for which a credit is allowed under Section 7001 and 7003 of the Family First Coronavirus Response Act are not included. How do you determine the eligible period for the 8 weeks? The law and the forgiveness application gives you 2 options. Option 1 is the covered period, 56 days from when you received your PPP disbursement. Or option 2, that might be more at your advantage, the alternative covered period is 56 days from the date you issued your first payroll after the PPP disbursement. Payroll nuances that are important to understand. Payroll costs are considered paid on the day that paychecks are distributed or the borrower originates an ACH credit transaction. Payroll costs are considered incurred on the day that the employee's pay is earned. Payroll and costs incurred but not paid during the borrower's last pay period of the covered period are eligible for forgiveness if paid on or before the next regular payroll date. So there's some leeway at the end. Remember that for each individual employee, the total amount of cash compensation eligible for forgiveness may not exceed an annual salary of $100,000 as prorated for the covered period, and the prorated number is $15,835. You cannot bonus up yourself, as an example, in the period in excess of $15,835. And you must count payroll costs that were both paid and incurred only once. Owners cannot be paid more on a prorated basis than they were in 2019. If you earn $50,000 in 2019, you are not entitled to now earn $100,000 in 2019, as an example. Eligible non-payroll costs include mortgage obligations. Remember, this is purely interest, does not include any prepayment or payment of principal. It includes the covered rent obligations for the primary location of your business, and it includes covered utility payments. There have been questions about what utilities are included. These for distribution of electricity, gas, water, transportation, telephone, or internet access. Those are defined as utilities. non-payroll costs. And eligible non-payroll costs must be paid during the covered period or incurred during the covered period and paid on or before the next regular billing date, even if the billing date is after the covered period. Eligible non-payroll costs cannot exceed 25% of the total forgiveness amount, and you cannot count payroll costs that were both paid and incurred. You can only count payroll costs once that were both paid and incurred during the time period. Remember that when you sign the forgiveness application, you'll make certain certifications. You will certify that the amount for which forgiveness is requested was used to pay costs that are eligible for forgiveness. You will include all applicable reductions due to decreases in the number of full-time equivalent employees and salary hourly wage reductions. You will agree that you do not include non-payroll costs in excess of 25% of the amount requested, and does not include 8 weeks worth of $29,000 compensation for any owner employee or individual general partner that is in excess of $15,385,000 per individual. You also sign that you understand that if the funds were knowingly used for unauthorized purposes, the federal government may pursue recovery of loan amounts and or civil or criminal fraud charges against you. Now, the question is, what can reduce your forgiveness? If your average FTE count during the forgiven period was reduced from the comparable prior year period that you selected in your PPP application, you will have your forgiveness reduced. And if you reduced your pay of your employees by more than 25%, you will have it reduced. The formulas that are proposed are quite complicated as to how you figure out these reductions and the ratios. And rather than going through them in detail on this webinar and risk putting everyone to sleep, I'm going to suggest that you work through these with your CPA or advisor. There are some exemptions for the reductions of FTE. Any positions for which the borrower made a good faith written offer to rehire an employee during the covered period or the alternative period that was rejected for the employee, you will not be penalized in the amount that you can get forgiven. You will not get forgiveness for money that you didn't pay them. However, you will not be penalized for the amount you paid other employees because of their decision not to come back. And any employee who during the covered period or the alternative payroll covered period were fired for cause, voluntarily resigned, or voluntarily requested and received a reduction of their hours, you will not be penalized for these reductions. Also, if you don't bring everyone back, but you bring them back on June 30th, then you will not be penalized for those losses. This is very unclear. It doesn't make sense if you bring them back on June 30th and then you fire them or let them go again on July 1st, if that counts. However, the current application states that as long as you restate the people by June 30th, you won't be allowed to get forgiven for the amount that you didn't pay them, but you won't be penalized for not bringing them back earlier. Let's go through some examples. This one is a borrower who I called the low rent district. His PPP loan amount was $100,000, which is 2.5 times their monthly payroll. They followed the rule and they spent exactly $80,000 or $80,000 on their payroll. And they spent on rent, utilities, and interest $15,000, which makes them a total forgiveness request of $95,000, which should be simply granted. And they would have a loan balance outstanding of $5,000 due over the next 2 years. The high rent district borrower, who also played by the rules and spent $80,000 worth on payroll, spent $25,000 in rent, utilities, and interest because they like a more expensive building. While they technically spent $105,000, their forgiveness request will be $100,000 because the request cannot exceed the loan amount. And they should have the full $100,000 granted because the $20,000 they're getting for their rent, utilities, and interest is under 25% of the total amount. So that is the example of the high rent district. Now, example 3 is somebody who followed the safe harbor rules, but didn't bring everyone back in time. This person also got the PPP for $100,000 or 2.5 times payroll. But instead of spending the $80,000 on payroll, they only spent $60,000 because they didn't bring everyone back. They also spent $15,000 on rent, utilities, and interest during the 8-week period. Their safe harbor adjustments are $0 because by June 30th, they brought everyone back. So their forgiveness application was not hurt. This makes their total forgiveness request $75,000, which should be granted, and their loan balance is $25,000. Example number 4, I'm going to call this entrepreneur the do it their way entrepreneur. Anyone know a few of those? They got the PPP loan amount for $100,000, but they spent on payroll only $60,000, and they spent $15,000 on rent, utilities, and interest. Because they did not match their full-time employees or their payroll amount by June 30th, their forgiveness deduction based on these particular calculations was reduced by $18,750. Therefore, they will only be granted $56,250 of forgiveness, and they will have a loan balance due of $43,750. I just want to share with all of you the documents you will need to submit along with your application. This is important so you know what documents you need to keep filed and keep working on. You will need to verify the eligible cash compensation and non-cash benefits paid during the covered period. You will need to provide bank account statements or third-party payroll service provider reports documenting the amount of cash compensation paid to employees. You will need to provide tax forms or equivalent third-party payroll service reports for the period that overlap with the covered period or the alternative paycheck period. And you will need to provide payment receipts, cancel checks, or account statements documenting the amount of any employer contributions to employee health insurance and retirement plans that you include in your forgiveness amount. You will have to provide FTE documentation showing your full-time FTEs. You'll have to demonstrate the average number of FTE employees on payroll per month employed by the borrower between February 15th and June 30th, 2019. You will have to show the average number of FTE employees on payroll per month employed by the borrower between January 1st and February 29th, 2020. And in the case of seasonal employer, the average number of FTE employees on payroll per month employed by the borrower between February 15th and June 30th, between January 1st, 2020 and February 29th, 2020, or any consecutive 12-month period between May 1st, 2019 and September 15th, 2019. You will have to provide business mortgage interest payments, business rent or lease payments, including a copy of your current lease, and business utility payments, including copies of invoices from February 2020 and those paid during the covered period, and receipts, cancel checks, or account statements verifying these eligible payments. You need to provide thorough and exhaustive documentation for your forgiveness request. You must also agree to keep and not submit certain documents. Documentation supporting the listing of each individual employee in the Schedule A worksheet, and specifically that each employee received during the single pay period in 2019 compensation at an annualized rate of more than $100,000. Documentation regarding any employee job offers and refusals, firings or calls, voluntary resignations, and written requests by any employee for reductions in work schedule, and documentation supporting the PPP Schedule A worksheet, FTE reduction safe harbor. That is the information that we have to share today. We'll soon open up to Q&A. MultiFunding is setting up a group of CPA partners to assist business owners through the PPP forgiveness process. For more information regarding, please reach out to ami@multifunding.com, and we will get this information out to you as soon as it is available. This Aminar, again, will be emailed to you and posted on our community site, and additional Aminars will be announced as significant new information becomes available. Now we are going to open the floor to the moderators to go through the questions. Please bear in mind there are a lot of people in here and a lot of questions. We'll do our best to get to each of you. Thanks.
Thank you, Ami. For the alternative payroll covered period, we presume you cannot use the method if you're on bi-monthly pay cycle. If you change your pay cycle during the 8-week period, could you use the alternative payroll method?
I think it would be looked down if you change it and not encouraged to change it to the 8-week period. And that would be extremely complicated with your payroll program. The exemption is designed for people for their regular payroll periods to match that, but not to make changes.
If an employee resigns because she got another job, can I reduce the required FTE count for safe harbor calculations? And what will be the required documentation for this?
You will have to keep, you can reduce it. You won't get forgiveness for the amount you didn't pay her, but you need to document that, and then you will not be penalized for losing her because she resigned.
If we did not receive the full amount of PPP due to the previous lack of clarity on partnerships, can we submit for an additional amount through a different lender to get the balance of our PPP distribution for the partners?
I don't think you can do it with a different lender, but there should be a process where you could go ask for an amendment with your existing lender.
Can you use 100% of your PPP funds for payroll costs?
The answer is, I don't think so. I mean, it's a maybe, but if you use 100% of them for payroll costs, that means that something was overstated in your application. So it's not a scenario that I saw outlined, and I think that will be something that will come up in guidance.
Can we give bonuses with the PPP? Is there a limit amount if you can bonus?
Again, there's nothing explicitly that says you can't, but there is you're going to list per employee or per partner or owner what you gave, and no partner, owner, or employee can earn more than the 15,835 during the forgiveness period. So there might be a little bit of latitude, but not much. And if you're giving someone a substantial bonus that they've never earned historically, that could raise an audit flag.
How will sole proprietors need to document their payroll for PPP funds used that way?
It's a good question, and it's not highly documented in the paperwork. And I think that will be an area that will come up for guidance. But I think if you simply document what you paid yourself or what you were able to take out for personal expenses, you should be okay.
If granted 10K in EIDL only, do I need to document how it was spent to claim it under PPP?
It's interesting because the PPP forgiveness application asks if you got a grant and for how much, but it provides no clarity on what the impact is on that in the terms of the forgiveness application. That being said, if you took an EIDL grant or loan, you did certify or agree that you wouldn't use the money twice for the same purpose between the EIDL and the PPP.
Are federal and state payroll taxes included in the forgivable amount?
So I think I went through it. There are state taxes are included. Federal taxes are, let me just find it for you guys exactly. Oops. Federal employment taxes imposed or withheld between February 15th and June 30th, including the employees and employers' share of FICA and Railroad Retirement Act taxes, and income taxes required to be withheld from employees are not included.
If I do 401k matching in 2019, does the entire amount count as payroll?
I believe it counts in payroll only for the amount of time allocated. So 2.5 months of whatever you did in 2019, that really depends on how you did your PPP application. So if you included it and it was authorized in your PPP application, then it should be acceptable.
We receive PPP funding for 2 companies. Our president receives pay from both companies. Is that allowed?
Uh, it's an interesting question. I haven't seen anything in the regs that prohibits it, but I suspect that some things will come up in guidance that will likely prohibit that.
Are forgivable eligible payroll costs based on incurred and paid, or incurred or paid during the covered period?
There's some latitude on either side of it, but it has to be, you can have some grace on either side, but it has to essentially be incurred.
If my business does not open in the 8-week period after the funds have been appropriated, will I need to pay the entire amount back?
It has nothing to do whether your business opens or not. It has to do with what you did for your employees while your business was closed. The intent, again, this is the way it is constructed at the moment, and it might change, but all I can go off is what the law and the application say today. But the intent of it was to keep your employees paid, even if you were closed. So if you didn't do that, well, then it's not going to get forgiven. It has nothing to do whether you are open or closed.
There's many questions on what is transportation utility and how are they defining that?
I think that will come up in further guidance, but until we have that, we're kind of stuck.
We stopped allowing employees to use the PTO. Would that count if we allow that again? Likewise, we have been asking for overtime. Would that count as well for PPP?
I don't see a reason not, but that's something you should clarify with your CPA.
Will forgiveness be an option if we only can bring back half of our employees?
Forgiveness will be again, it's not, it's for the amount you incurred during the 8 weeks or the 56 days from the time that you got the PPP forgiven. And forgiveness will be an option, maybe taking away some of it if you didn't bring everyone back, but only for the amount that you spent on your employees during that time. If you didn't bring them back, you didn't incur any payroll expense during that time, you're not going to get anything forgiven the way it is constructed today.
We laid off some employees and had to pay accumulated vacation pay. Is that forgivable?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure.
Can LLC guaranteed member payments be included if those members did not receive any guaranteed payments in 2019?
I don't believe they can. You can pay them, but that can't be forgiven. An owner or a member's compensation cannot exceed what it was in 2019.
Are you allowed to pay back the rent that was deferred prior to receiving PPP funds? For example, April rent, PPP funds received in May?
I don't think so. I think you can only allow for the rent during the 8-week period from the time you got your money during the 56-day week or during the 56 days.
Is there a deadline for how late you can submit the PPP forgiveness application that you're aware of right now?
I'm not aware of any deadline, but since technically at some point you're incurring interest on it as a loan, it is in your interest to get it submitted and done and off your books as soon as possible.
What will happen if we use 90% of the loan amount, even though out of the 90%, 75% was payroll costs and 25% was for rent and utilities?
I'm sorry, can you run that again, please?
Yes, so what will happen if we only use 90% of the loan? And then out of the 90%, 75% of that 90 was for payroll and 25 for rent and utilities.
Well, you're not required to use 100% of the loan during the 2 months for the payroll, rent, utilities, or interest. you are required for over what duration you want to use the money for those things. What will happen to your forgiveness in the 2 months really is driven by how much you actually spent on payroll and how that compares to the 80% of what you should have if your PPP application was originally accurate.
We have little rent costs, but heavy vehicle lease payments. For the allowable 25%, can a vehicle lease payment count?
I don't think so.
Is workers' comp and disability, if paid from by the employer, eligible for forgiveness?
I believe so.
Is interest on debt other than mortgage, like a line of credit, forgivable if the debt was from before February 15th?
No, purely the interest on the real estate of the building that you own and operate your business out of, if you own or operate it. Any other interest on any other debt is not considered eligible.
We have a couple questions about you explaining 10 weeks of payroll and then 8 weeks of payroll. Can you clarify what you were trying to explain?
Sure, so let me go back to that, guys. When you applied for your PPP application, you essentially, your application had nothing to do with your rent, your utilities, your mortgage. It was purely a factor of your payroll, and you were able to apply for 2.5 months of your eligible payroll cost. So in this example of this application, it's $100,000. That's for 10 weeks, or $10,000 for this example, $10,000 a week of payroll cost. When you go for your forgiveness, you're only able to get forgiven 8 weeks of payroll cost. In this example, 8 weeks is $80,000. Then you have $20,000 left in your loan with some flexibility. In this case, if during the 8 weeks you only spent $15,000 in rent, utilities, and interest, then your forgiveness ask can only be for $95,000, and you have a loan balance of $5,000. I hope that makes it clearer.
When does interest start accruing? Is it from the date the funds are received, or is it the date the loan is forgiven?
I'll get back to you guys on that in the community. If I recall correctly, the interest starts accruing 6 months after the date the loan was issued. That gives a little bit of latitude to work through the forgiveness, but I'm not, that's just off memory, and I'm not 100% sure.
Can you use back pay or forward pay to count towards PPP?
No. The amount it paid is for the amount incurred during the 8-week period.
And how will the expenses over the 8-week be calculated, by cash basis or accrual?
It seems to be, by my reading of it, it's by cash basis.
Are distributions to shareholders of a sub-S corp forgivable?
I think that's something you have to check with your accountant on. I'm not sure.
For establishing costs that fell within the 8-week period, do we use the date of the bill or the date the money was drawn from the account, or is it up to us to decide?
I think there's a little latitude on both sides of that, based on if you choose the alternative eligible period or the first eligible period. But the principle of it is that the money will be forgiven as long as it was intended or allocated for use during the 8-week period.
I'm a seasonal business, and 75% of my PPP loan was for more than 8 weeks of my payroll. I'm afraid I will not spend enough on payroll to have it forgiven. Can I give my employees a raise or a bonus to reach that 75% goal?
I'm sorry, I've not spent enough time thinking through the forgiveness app specifically for a seasonal business, so I don't feel qualified to answer that question.
What if you have voluntary departure of employees? We have an employee who is leaving for a new job. How will this impact our headcount analysis?
So if an employee voluntarily leaves, you can't get forgiveness for the time period, what you would have spent on them, even though they left, but you won't be penalized for that reduction in headcount. You do need to document that carefully.
If we meet the desired FTE count by hiring employees back on June 28th, how long must we retain these employees to fully qualify for the forgiveness?
That's a super good question, and one that completely baffles me because all it says is June 30th. So technically, by the way the rules are constructed now, you could let them go on July 1st and get that forgiveness amount, but that makes absolutely no sense to me, and I don't think it'll stand.
Are employer paid disability premiums allowed as part of the forgivable healthcare costs?
I believe they are, but I would clarify that with your CPA or accountant.
What will the tax implications be? Can we choose to have less forgiven if we want to lower the interest rates as a way to lower our taxes?
I'm sorry, I'm not a tax expert, so while that sounds like an interesting scenario, I encourage you to discuss that with your tax advisors.
Would a severance payment need to be annualized and dropped to below 100K?
I would believe so for that part of it to be counted.
If my company is closed and I got a PPP, but I haven't had payroll period, under the alternative dates, when does my 8 weeks start?
It has nothing to do with your company being open or closed. When you took the PPP, the intent, if you were going to get it forgiven, the intent was to keep your people employed for the 8 weeks, and that might, the alternative period might deviate a few days by when your regular payrolls go, but it's not like you can suddenly start your payroll 8 weeks later. It's not how it works if you want it forgiven.
What if I hire new employees, therefore my payroll goes up? Can payroll cover the entire loan amount?
And I think we got asked that question before, and it's a super interesting question. And I don't know, I don't see anywhere in there that there's a cap that the payroll cannot exceed 80%. So I think it's entirely possible, but some guidance might come out to change that.
In regards to owner's compensation, what if you suspended your own pay prior to receiving the PPP? During the covered pay period, can I increase my pay higher than what I got paid in 2019 in order to make up for the pay period suspended?
I don't think so.
If the employer contracts new employees for increased business, does this qualify as part of the payroll cost?
Yeah, again, it's an interesting question, and one I'm sure I'll write about in the next couple of days when I get clarity on it. Question is, can you get more than 80% of it eligible for payroll if you increase your payroll? And my inclination is that you probably can, and I haven't read anything to say that you can't, but it's something I want to check before I give a firm opinion on that.
How do you calculate the equivalent employees for part-time workers? Is it number of hours, 40 hours a week, or part-time employees?
So in the calculation, there is a way of adding up your FTE based on number of hours, and based on number of hours, you give it certain credit per person. I chose not to go through that in the presentation today because it's quite complicated. But if you go to the application, which we'll also post on the site, it is in there, and that might be an interesting separate blog post that we can write.
I have 2 businesses. one holding property and one operating. The operating company received the PPP. The holding company leases property to the operating company. Written lease in place. Can the operating company that got the PPP include lease payments to the holding company as part of the PPP forgiveness?
I think it's perfectly acceptable as long as that was a lease in place well before and you've been making those payments regularly. I don't see a reason why you wouldn't be able to do that.
If an employee's salary is above 100K and the only forgiveness is asked for about 15K, is it permissible to pay them more?
I think you can pay them whatever you want, but you can't get forgiveness in excess of that amount.
As a sole proprietor, does it matter when I pay myself if I don't have myself on payroll, but take random draws throughout the year?
I would think you want to take draws during the allotted time to, at a minimum, match the amount that you're going to be asked to be forgiven. And if you don't do that or have proof or documentation of that, that might be a problem.
Under the utilities covered for transportation that cover mileage reimbursements for driving to job, or does it reimburse the employee's use of personal cell phones that they use for the job?
That's further guidance about the utilities will have to come out, and I don't know.
We will make our annual retirement plan profit sharing employer contribution payment during the covered pay period. This profit sharing amount is based on wages earned in 2019. Since it will be paid during the covered period, is the employer's contributions considered a cost eligible for PPP forgiveness?
I don't think so.
If a company has 2 locations, is the rent paid for both locations forgivable or only the rent on their primary location?
Both locations should be fine.
Is there any stipulations on hiring new staff and how it contributes to the overall rehire count?
You do have to sort of put per employee and what they were compensated in your filings, but I don't think it hurts you for hiring new staff.
Who will judge whether I spend the loan correctly for forgiveness, the bank or the SBA?
The bank has to do it, and if you don't like their answer, there will be some appeal process with the SBA that will be set up, but you have to go to your bank or your lender to do this, and they will have to work through the process.
How does the $1,000 EIDL grant for each employee figure into these calculations?
I think we went through that earlier. It's quite interesting because on the 11-page application, it clearly says that you have to write down and document what you did for employee if you got an EIDL grant, but it doesn't tell you anything to do with it. So right now, I think that guidance will come out about that, and that might have been some kind of error, but we have to wait and see.
What happens if you paid a lot of overtime in February, but not during the forgiveness period?
I think that's going to hurt your forgiveness application.
If you're in a state that is still on lockdown, making it difficult to hire back during these 8 weeks, is there going to be an extension on the time frame to hire them back?
There are political discussions going on about that, and it could change, but right now in the law or in the documentation that we've been provided, there's nothing. So will that be a part of a bipartisan agreement? And does that that probably has to go through Congress because it's a lot of money, and time will tell. That's why, again, folks, I'm trying to convince, if there's one core message here, it's important to understand this. It's important to think about it. It's important to get ready. But if there's one thing I can promise you, and we saw this with PPP, is that this is the first draft and things are going to change. So, and there's still some time to work it. So you can understand the framework today, and you should, just knowing that, knowing and accepting that I could jump back on here in a week and tell you, sorry guys, everything's different. And if that's frustrating to you, it's more frustrating to me.
Can 100% be spent on payroll if it's an LLC or 1099?
And that comes back to an interesting question. Can 100% spend on payroll, which means that if you did that, you actually made your payroll higher than it was in the time last year. And it's a super interesting question that has come up a lot today. And there's nothing in there that I read that says that it can't, but that will be definitely something we'll be writing about in the next days and thinking about and talking to folks about to try to get clarity on.
If I have salespeople that the commissions of 2019 are due in May, can these payments be considered as part of the forgiveness total?
I'm sorry, Hannah, can you please repeat that question?
If I have salespeople that the commissions are due from 2019 are due in May, can these payments be considered as part of the forgiveness total?
I don't think so. I don't think that would pass.
For S Corp owners, will canceled check for owner's draw be documentation?
I think that should be sufficient, but again, the owner's draw can't exceed the 15,385 during the 8 weeks.
We have a bunch on workers' comp. So where does workers' compensation insurance cost fall into this? And are workers' comp insurance payments considered non-cash employee compensation?
So my answer is, I think they are, and I think they would count, but if I'm wrong, which I might be, we'll get back to you and clarify that.
We had to downsize our leased area going forward. It costs us a termination fee for the reduced space. Is this amount deductible?
I don't think so.
Any idea about deductibility of 2019 401k contributions paid during the coverage period?
Again, it's confusing to me because it's really on a cash basis. So a lot of questions are around trying to pay things in 2019 during the 2020 covered period and get forgiveness for that. So you're asking for forgiveness for expenses incurred last year, and I don't think that's going to fly.
Given that we are working from home, are we allowed to pay some of the part of our personal rent and utilities at some amount or less than the total as part of the forgiveness?
That's a super good question, and there's nothing in the documentation that says you're allowed to do that. So barring a bunch of complex IRS rulings that would have to come out pretty quickly, I don't see that that's going to fly.
Do the same employees that you're submitting payroll need to be, do the employees need to be the same, or can you have recently hired and fired new people?
I don't think they have to be the same, but the FTE count and the total dollar counts have to match.
Sounds like we can't use the extra PPP funds to prepay employees. Is that correct?
Correct. This is, I mean, everyone has to remember that this is taxpayer money, and you have to carefully document. So if it's your taxpayer money and it's the business next door, you would want and expect a certain level of clarity and documentation about exactly what is being forgiven, and it has to be permissible. So the same principles apply for your business here. And in the 11-page application, which seems so exhausting, they are trying to close out every loophole, and there are some that they haven't thought about, and they're going to try to close them up in the next few weeks, and there'll still be some they'll miss, but that's their plan.
Are part-time workers covered under the PPP loan?
it doesn't really matter if they're part-time or full-time. They get counted at a certain ratio in your full-time, figure out your total full-time calculation, and it's driven by how they compare to your payroll expense last year versus this year.
Can you give back the loan if you don't use it all?
You can't really give it back, but you can pay it off early if you want to, if you don't need the cash.
If an owner who receives guaranteed payments on a K-1 considered allowable payroll expense?
It should be, but only up to the 15,835 during the 8-week period.
In regards to interest, it talks about personal property interest. Could that include items under a UCC?
No, the way I understand it, it purely includes your, at least the way I interpret it, it only includes interest incurred for your business building if you own the building or plant where you run your business out of.
Is the interest on solar loan forgiveness as a utility or a capital lease?
All good questions, and I always thought I was smart until I get all these questions. I don't know.
When does the period during which I can submit request forgiveness start? After the 8-week period or June 30th?
That might partially depend where your bank is ready, but if you have no safe harbor considerations, you should be able to do it right after the 8-week period. If you have safe harbor considerations, you might want to wait. It's also possible that some of the rules and regs will change, and so there might be some reason, depending on how in flux things are, to even wait a little bit just to see if things change a little bit in your favor.
We have 3 individuals who are paid as 1099 and included in our regular payroll. Can I include them in our payroll costs?
You shouldn't have been able to include them in your PPP application, and you shouldn't be able to include them now. They're not. They have the right to go and file their own PPPs, so they can. That's how it has to work.
If an employee doesn't return and I qualify for safe harbor, can I pay the remaining staff the difference?
I think you can.
Does receipt of PPP make you ineligible for the PUA program after the 2-month period?
Sorry, I'm not familiar with what the PUA program is, so I don't know how to answer that.
Does the member draw count as the 75% towards payroll or towards the other 25%?
It counts towards payroll, but as long as it doesn't exceed the 15,385, and as long as it's not more than the member drew last year on a prorated basis.
If we hired additional people after we submitted our application, can we use the funds to pay partially for those new people?
Yeah, again, that comes back to a super interesting question, and the answer is I think so, but we need to clarify that.
Can you use amounts the employer contributes to an employee's HSA as healthcare expense?
I don't think so. Folks, just to clarity, we are going to wrap this up at 6 o'clock Eastern, so we have time for a few more questions, and then we're going to have to wrap up. I want to reiterate that we will post this on realtime.inc.com for you to share if you want to. We will email everyone a copy of the slides as well as a copy of the recording so that you can re-listen or take it or share it with whoever you want to. We won't continue these regularly, but when there is, and we likely will be, any substantial changes or new rules or guidance that comes out that provides further clarity, we will go ahead and announce a new session and let you all know so that you can log on and get it. So I just wanted to give you our game plan going forward. We're not going to do these every day until there's something new to add, because you can just go online and listen whenever you want.
When should one submit forgiveness? In the beginning or wait? Plus, when is the latest that we can submit for the forgiveness of PPP?
Some of that will depend upon your bank, and I think you should see, if everything's pretty crystal clear and you have a super simple application, you might as well go and get it done right away and get it forgiven. If your application is more vague and has more intricacies, it might behoove you to wait a little bit of time to see if there's more clarity. It just depends where things are.
How would the alternative covered period be communicated by the lender?
It's really up to you to decide which is something you should consult with your CPA or financial advisor with, to figure out which is more advantageous to you. But it will really be a matter of which one works best for you. And then you'll go to the lender and request whatever you want.
What documents does an independent
Between the two, sorry.
What documents an independent contractor needs to have if they're audited?
I think you need to just keep careful documentation of what you paid yourself during the period.
Are you supposed to submit the application for forgiveness to the lender or to the SBA directly?
To the lender.
Are forgivable expenses based on bill date, pay date, or accrued date?
It's really based on when the actual expense was incurred, which is common. It's a little bit of a combination of all the three.
We pay business insurance quarterly. Can we prorate for 2 months?
I don't think business insurance is considered an eligible expense.
Our employees received a raise on the 1st of January. Therefore, our payroll is higher this year than last year. Is that okay to ask for forgiveness for the new payroll amounts?
Again, the question is, that's your payroll, which is great, but can you get more than 80% of your payroll costs that you applied for forgiven? And I think you can, but we're going to get clarification on that.
Your slide about FICA makes it sound that employees' FICA is not included as a covered cost. Is that correct?
Correct.
For an employee who earns more than 100K, what is the total amount to be paid to that employee?
The total amount, you can pay them whatever you want, but the amount that you can apply for forgiveness for is the $15,385.
What are the guidelines for the Eid L Advance that many of us got? Does that amount have the same rules as the PPP?
You can use that for some slightly different reasons, including just payables or damage to your business. But what you can't do is you can't use the PPP and the EIDL for the same reasons. That's not permitted. You can't double dip. Folks, it's unfortunately, I have another commitment. So it's 6 o'clock Eastern and we're going to have to wrap up. I know this is a complicated issue and I apologize if I haven't been able to answer a lot of your questions to your satisfaction. I assure you that as there is more clarity that comes out, we will be happy to provide it with you. And I hope most importantly that everybody is healthy and safe, and just keep in mind that while this PPP issue is important, perhaps the most important is your go-forward strategy for your business, and encourage everyone to pay a little bit of attention to PPP forgiveness, but pay most attention to figuring out what you're going to do next and how you're going to do it, and trying to get out of this rut, because America counts on entrepreneurs like us to move forward. So with that, we're going to leave you and I wish you all a good evening. Take care now. Bye-bye.
Thank you.